Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. Our broadcast today comes from our most recent MetaStrategy Digital Symposium. The topic is the journey from CIO to COO. And the panelists who spoke about this topic were Chris Drumgoole, the Chief Operating Officer of DXC Technology, and Jeff Smith, the Chief Operating Officer of World Fuel Services. Each of them are former Chief Information Officers multiple times over. The gentleman who led the conversation was MetaStrategy's Vice President and East Coast lead, Alex Kraus, who joins me now. Alex, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Happy to be here and be facilitating another interesting conversation.
Well, Alex, let's talk about the journey from Chief Information Officer to Chief Operating Officer. This is still a small group, an exclusive club, certainly, but talk a bit about your own perspectives about that rise from CIO to COO.
Yes, indeed. This is still a very exclusive club, but it's certainly growing in numbers. And I imagine that many members of our audience are very interested in considering that step. So I believe there are a number of reasons why technology executives are so well positioned to take the step to become an operations executive as well. I think some of that speaks to the importance of digital capabilities, data, and technology, more broadly speaking, are all things that are traditionally under the purview of the CIO and things that have become more important in most organizations these days. Also, I think it's the unique experiences that most CIOs have that position them well for that transformation. I think some of that is that they bring not only technological acumen, but also business experience and leadership experience to the table.
Interesting overview. I mentioned the two executives already, Chris Drumgoole, the COO of DXC Technology, and Jeff Smith, the COO of World Fuel Services. Talk a bit about your perspectives on the two of them.
Yes, absolutely. So it's pretty amazing. I think between the two of them, they have more than 50 years of experience under their belt, and that's impressive, even for CIOs. So Jeff is the COO of World Fuel Services, a $20 billion energy commodities and services company based in Florida. It's 5,000 professionals, provide more than 50 energy products to tens of thousands of customers around 200 countries in the world, really. Jeff was appointed as COO in 2017. He came from IBM, where, among other things, he led the agile transformation for IBM. Prior to that, he had a CEO role, and he has been in that role for a number of years now. Chris Drumgoole is the EVP and Chief Operating Officer of DXC Technology. DXC Technology is a $20 billion American multinational IT services and consulting company headquartered in Ashburn, Virginia, and has about 130,000 employees and operates in 70 countries. It was founded in 2017 when HP Enterprise spun off as an enterprise services business, and it merged with Computer Science Corporation. Chris was named EVP and COO in August of last year, reporting directly to DXC's president and CEO. He joined as CIO in March of 2020. Prior to that role, he was the CIO at GE, where he led the company's global technology operations. He has more than 20 years of experience in the digital and information technology industry. I'm very excited to have both of them on the panel here.
Well, without further ado, let's get into our conversation. The journey from CIO to COO, featuring Chris Drumgoole of DXC Technology, Jeff Smith from World Fuel Services, with MetaStrategy's own Alex Kraus.
Welcome both. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So Jeff, let's maybe start with you. When we last spoke, you talked that as the COO, you really see responsibilities, including things like operationalizing culture and measuring productivity of your teams. And I wonder if you can explain to your colleagues and to the audience what you mean by that and how you go about that.
Sure. I think maybe the first thing is that culture is about the only unique thing any company has. You can generally copy product strategies. It's hard to copy culture. So if you can do it well, you can create a competitive advantage. But operationalizing it to me is making it tangible. It's making it something you can learn, you can practice, you can get better at it, you can measure it. And generally, the biggest constraint in doing this is not constraint of time and money. It's the constraint of thought. So the dream we had was, can I get the innovation and the pace of the best small tech companies, but the scale of a big corporate? And the problem to solve in doing that is generally you get big companies, you have big problems that are complicated, hard to communicate, and you have lots of layers of people in between the people that are managing the work and the people that are doing the work. So the question is, can we take big problems, break them into small problems, distribute them, and multi-process the problem through small, very direct, very talented, small agile squads? And so the thing you have to do is you have to build the talent density up, and you have to find a way. I have a term called the BMI. It's not a body mass index. It's a bureaucracy mass index. How many leaders to doers? And if you can lower the friction between having a real clear objective, then you can distribute that work, across the squads, and you can get the pace and the throughput and productivity of the best, best tech companies. So to do that, we really came up with a playbook, and our playbook was, let's break culture into about 30 practices. There's like 10 leadership, 10 collaboration, 10 delivery. And the interesting thing is 2/3 of those practices are non-tech related. So as a COO, I manage a lot of back office functions as well as IT, and implementing this culture was just as relevant to my financial operations as it was the IT folks. So we created training for that. We had coaches to help people once people were trained. We take measurements every quarter. We have a thing called an agile maturity assessment for every squad, where we look at throughput, velocity, cycle time, and WIP, which is from the time a feature is designed to the time it's in production. And interestingly, cycle time in the backlog. We found out that we were finding requirements that were there for like 2 years that are not relevant anymore, but we were still planning to build them. So you get the fewest amount of metrics that you need in order to give the signals for people to get better. And the culture is, these things are not here to spank you, they're there to help you. And then later on, what we also added was a measurement around what we call leadership maturity assessment, which are 6 dimensions of leadership that we think are applicable whether you're a first line leader or an executive. We didn't want to differentiate and say, well, we've got executive training leaders and we've got middle managers and we've got first line. The reality is, outside of scale and complexity, leadership's still the same. So those 6 metrics were around forming teams, make sure they're diverse, they work well together, distributing work, which is the single biggest complaint employees have of their leaders, is that they get too much WIP at one time and they can't be productive. Measuring the things that matter, attracting the right people in and retaining them, listening and learning from others, which is probably the second other characteristic that we struggle with. People like to learn from themselves and their close mates, but maybe not people outside of their horizon. And then influence and impact, and we add an NPS onto that. So in general, our playbook for operationalizing is we've got it. Everyone knows it. I can go and ask any squad. I said, what's our culture? And they'll say, well, we're good on these 8 practices. We're learning on these 2. We're not doing these 3 well, or collaboration. And it's something that you can scale across all organizations. The only thing that generally difference are in the IT side. You have delivery processes around your continuous delivery and DevOps, practices. But the reality is, 2/3 of your culture is non-tech related. And that's been the learning for us.
Excellent. Wonderful. I love that. And also combining, the agility that you clearly, not just preach by practice, but a combination with culture. And then most importantly, the metrics, they go hand in hand. That's, I think, great insights. Thank you for sharing that. Chris, since you assumed the COO role, you have emphasized at numerous occasions that the employee experience is also at the center of what you think about as the COO and leader in the organization. And Jeff mentioned it already. You also use NPS to gauge both employee satisfaction, but also to make course corrections. Can you explain a little bit how you go about that and what the results are that you're seeing?
Yeah, Alex, it's a good question. Thanks. And exactly as Jeff mentioned, he said, as he was just taking you through his kind of culture process there, he talked about listening and learning from others. And we really, as DXC, we're a people business and we have a people first strategy. And that means we should actually really start with, what do our people need? And when we step back, and by the way, we felt the same way at GE, and you look at a lot of the traditional metrics that IT people, I am one, use to measure their business. We talk about the user a lot, we talk about times a lot, we talk about uptime, reliability, but we very rarely talk about is the customer, the user, getting what they fundamentally want and need and think is best in order to kind of make their world better. So we took a page right out of the kind of consumer retail book around NPS, because retail lives and dies whether or not a customer decides to come back into that business and spend their money again. So why are we taking the same approach to the way our employees think about everything? IT, internal systems, processes, you name it. And really, when you get into that world, the best metric is a true, honest, and I focus on the word honest, NPS. So the way we use it here is we have a rolling survey that goes out every month so that the data is perpetually flowing in. It's not a point in time exercise. It's a constant flow of real-time feedback coming from our team that tells us exactly where we should be putting our time, energy, and effort, and where things are really creating friction, or as we call it in the company, kind of sand in the gears of the business. And how do we go and attack those things? Because listen, frankly, I used to say we can all sit in the corporate office and pontificate about what's happening in the field. Now we can all sit in our virtual bedrooms, but no one is closer to our customers than the folks on the ground dealing with them. And NPS is really our means to go to them and get their feedback on directly what's working, because frankly, they know best. And we've had a lot of experiences where something that might have been really high on the priority of an internal team, whether it was IT or, say our travel team or our procurement team, when you went to the customer base, meaning our employees, our people, our team, you realize it really wasn't that important to them. So claiming success on it would have been great. Everybody would have patted each other on the back, but we really didn't make the world better for our employees and therefore our customers. And that's why we really angled at NPS, because it gives us that real data. And again, we've been surprised, sometimes pleasantly so, around small improvements that you can make that really have a really big impact that probably would have fallen off the radar if we just looked at traditional metrics. So again, it's all part of kind of a people-first strategy, trusting that our people know what's best for their customers, and then being our job as leaders, which is to sit back, listen, and deliver for them, frankly.
That's great. No, I love that, and especially I think you said it earlier. NPS and the course corrections don't need to be and don't have to be transformational, but they can be small, as you just said, really impactful and part of the continuous improvement. That's great. Jeff, you already mentioned that you use NPS as well. Anything in particular that you would like to add to what Chris just explained?
I think Chris said it well. I think for us, we do it with our leaders every quarter. And my take, and Chris said like monthly, anything you do once a year, you don't do well. So the more frequency you can do it, the better. We just asked two questions, which is, would you recommend your leader to an outside colleague? Would you recommend your squad to an outside colleague? And we publish the results. We think it's important that, as leaders, we've always historically been really good at managing the people and measuring the people doing the work. We don't want to measure ourselves. So, it's equally as important to give the signals to the leaders, because that also makes you endear the people doing the work that, hey, you really care about creating a productive environment for people. So I think that's what we do it every quarter for the leaders. And it's two simple questions. And it's a really good gauge on, are the leaders creating a good environment for the people that work for them?
But just to build on Jeff's point there, I think one really key, and I love his concept of doing it for the leaders. But one thing that I've seen other people, because you say we do NPS and everyone's like, oh, so do we do NPS too. But it's that concept of continuous improvement, publishing the results and bringing it in. I love his comment about if you do it once a year, you might as well do it, because we've all seen, oh, we did the survey, we're going to spend all next year and then hope that the survey question gets better. Well, we all kind of know that doesn't work. It's really about continuous improvement. How do we make small tweaks that just make the work tomorrow a little better than it was today? And then when you wake up a few months from now, you'll realize you had transformation without ever calling it that.
Yeah, that's great. Good. No, I'm glad to see that you not only agree, but share the positive impacts of that across very different industries, clearly. So as you both made that transition from the senior most technology executive to a business leader with an even broader portfolio and perspective, what were the mindset shifts that you had to undertake or go through? And Chris, maybe we can start with you here.
But I think there's the couple big ones. Financial leadership and financial acumen goes without saying. And I think even if you don't have any aspirations to move beyond the CIO role, that's a very valuable skill, right? The way I always talk about financial acumen is, if you think about IT people, we're notorious for speaking in acronyms, and it's almost a kind of a joke in the industry that the IT people can't be understood. Well, I got news for you. The finance folks are exactly the same way. And if you don't learn to speak each other's language, you're never really going to be successful. So understanding, you don't need to be able to do regression models on the budget, but you do need to be able to speak and understand the financial acumen. And I think my experience has been to move beyond the CIO role is also to be able to have that financial acumen, not only from the view of an operator, but from the view of an investor in. And how do your investors, your owners, whether you're a public or a private company, what are the metrics they care about? What are the financial issues they care about that really help run the business? Because fundamentally, we are all here because we work for our owners. And if you speak and understand the language they speak, you'll be in much better shape. The other one I would say, and I don't know if it was on the list because it's gone now, doesn't influence me anymore, is, and I was lucky enough at GE, kind of very robust training, and I was honored enough to be a beneficiary of a lot of that, but kind of core operational training around how your business runs and understanding it from the view of the operator on the floor of the factory or on the sales floor or on the ship, wherever you may be, depending your industry, is really important. And I know, and I was guilty of this too, all CIOs think they know it because they're really close with their business. I would really suggest taking a step back and really knowing it, not through the lens of technology, but through the lens of the operator. Yeah. I think those two things combined put you on very good footing to make the next step.
Excellent, excellent, good. So Jeff, you had the benefit of listening to Chris, but I know you have a very good and well-informed perspective on this as well. So what's the biggest mindset shift for you as you transitioned?
Well, I think like Chris, I came from the IT side as well. And I think the thing is your natural thing is everyone's different. We're different in tech, finance operations is different. The reality is all groups have an operational component. So I think what Chris said about managing and measuring the right operational metrics, because that's the ticket to play. And then, every group has projects or programs that they run for new capability. But I think the insight was really our operationalizing culture when we started defining our 30 practices and figured out the 2/3 were non-group related. I mean, leadership practices are leadership practices. You can utilize those in any group. Collaboration practices, exactly the same. So we figured out that 2/3 of what we needed to learn to become productive were applicable to every group that I have globally. So I think that was a real big learning, that I thought things would just be a lot different. The reality is my financial operations, they may use robotics to automate processes, where my IT groups may use DevOps practices to build new portals and things. But the reality is that how you manage people is incredibly similar. We run the same exact agile maturity assessments, same exact leadership maturity for all organizations. And I would say the other thing I learned, and Chris mentioned it a bit on language, is really clear objectives at the top. If you want to eliminate noise and friction from the time you say we need to get this done to getting the work distributed to teams, your objectives have to be clear. And we really went after this. And so I wanted to make sure that anyone that got in a lift, could answer the question, on what the key objectives were. And just one example for ours was, we said, we're moving everything to the cloud. Now, what does that mean? And we said, as measured by, and we use the as measured by in our OKR really religiously, all data centers closed. Because there's no ambiguity there. People know we have to get our networks out, our telephony out, our applications out. But we did that in, real clear objectives that, we're digitizing our business as measured by eliminating all printers. So we had things like that made it tangible for people. And I think I didn't do a good enough job that, early in my career, that if you leave a bit of ambiguity as it flows down, it gets confused, and then you hire more leaders to connect the dots rather than the teams doing the work connecting the dots.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you. And I mean, we are talking to chief operating officers here, so we can't talk about COOs and two COOs without mentioning the supply chain. I think everybody on this call, as consumers and business and technologists, we experiencing supply chain challenges, and I want you both to talk a little bit about that. And Jeff, as a energy and commodities company with operations in 200 countries, supply chain is at the heart of what you do. Can you speak a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough going right now, because you had a couple of years where demand fell through the floor. Where our big industries are aviation and marine, and then all of a sudden it's come back at a faster pace than supply it. You add Russia in, where interestingly we had Russian customers, that we were supplying in, and at the same time there's Russian suppliers that supplying us, and now neither can pay each other, because of the embargoes. So you have to figure out, how do I adjust quickly? Now, luckily for us, we have about 2/3 of our logistics are third party. Now, we had digitized a lot of that, and all of a sudden we had to find alternate sources around the world, because that things have changed. Not only is there a shortage if there wasn't disruption, but you add Russia into it, and it's 3 times as bad. So I think, what we had to do is focus and get the problems that we can solve, the ones we can't, make it easier to find alternative suppliers, get those agreements done. And that's where, digital ingestion of data and marketplace, and to be able to move around supply chains has been critical. But, it's difficult. It's a daily battle, to manage this. I'd be lying and saying if we had it all solved. But I think we've got good thinking going into it, and we know the constraints, and we have good technology to facilitate it. But it's still tough.
Okay, great. Chris, speak a little bit about your operation supply chain experience in the light of geopolitical uncertainties.
Yeah, and I'll go quick, Alex. And I think I really, when it comes to supply chain, do not envy my friend Jeff, because his business is literally around moving, atoms around the world. I think to go quick, the Russia-Ukraine situation, on top of the global supply chain woes, I think has all taught us that it's a new world, right? So in our case in particular, we had thousands of people in both countries that we had to respond to make sure they were okay, cared for, in safety, at the same time that we're continuing to deliver from our customers. And that's kind of our people supply chain, if you will. And frankly, leading up to the conflict, we were preparing for it. But I don't think anyone here in our lifetimes has expected that we would see this again, land war in Europe. And I don't think any of us made our plans for it. If you look at a retail store, before and after e-commerce, you're going to see two very different things. I thought that was a very good kind of commentary. I think the exact same thing applies to supply chain. And I can tell you that's the way we're thinking about it. I think there's going to be before Russia supply chain thinking, and there's going to be after Russia supply chain thinking. And that's certainly the way we are thinking about it, is how do we diminish single country risk? How do we make sure that we're prepared? And what I would say is, when we think about supply chain, it's always been right, cost and quality. Those have always, since the beginning of time, those have been the metrics that you measure by. How do I get the best quality at the lowest cost? And I think what Russia, Ukraine has taught us, and this is certainly how we think about it at DXC, is that there's now a third piece of that equation, a third variable. It is now cost, quality, and resiliency. And resiliency has an equal seat at the table with cost and quality, whereas before it was kind of a secondary factor. And I think that's going to be the biggest change to industry, both on the physical supply chain of atoms, the human supply chain around making sure we all have amazing talent, and frankly, the digital supply chain around, we think about moving bits around the world through networks and through cyber. All three of those things are going to be kind of a pre-Ukraine area and a post-Ukraine message. I think that's the way we think about it.
Chris and Jeff, thank you both, and we will certainly continue the conversation.